There's a moment, somewhere in the late 1960s, when the average working person in most industrialized countries had simply stopped expecting much from a car. Not in any dramatic, conscious way, just quietly, gradually. The way you stop expecting a bus to be on time. You drove what you could afford. You fixed what broke. You didn't complain too loudly, because complaining required an alternative, and there wasn't really one. The car you owned was probably American, if you lived in America. It was probably large, probably thirsty, probably comfortable in a way that felt like a compromise between a sofa and a machine. The V8 was standard equipment on a lot of vehicles that had no business needing a V8. The turning radius was measured in city blocks. And somewhere between the second major repair and the third, you arrived at a quiet resignation. This is just what cars are. This is the deal. Nobody told you to expect less. You just absorbed it. The whole culture had. Into this world, in 1972, Honda introduced the Civic. It was small. It was cheap. It was built by a motorcycle company that most American dealers still couldn't take entirely seriously. And it would, over the next 50 years, quietly dismantle almost every assumption that world had made about what a car was supposed to be. Honda in 1972 was not a name that commanded much respect in automotive circles outside Japan. The company had been founded by Soichiro Honda in 1948. Originally as a motor bicycle operation in a small workshop in Hamamatsu, and had grown through sheer engineering conviction into one of the great motorcycle manufacturers in the world. Four-wheeled vehicles were newer territory. Honda had only entered the passenger car market in 1963 with the tiny T360 truck and the S500 sports car, and neither had made a significant impression internationally. What Honda had was an engineering culture, not a marketing culture, not a design by committee culture, but a culture built around the belief that if you understood a mechanical problem deeply enough, you could solve it in ways that other people hadn't considered yet. Soichiro Honda himself was a hands-on engineer in the most literal sense, a man who would walk onto a factory floor, disassemble a component that had failed, examine it personally, and tell the engineers standing next to him exactly what he thought. He was not always easy to work with. He was almost always right about the engineering. Japan in the early 1970s was running at a pace that the rest of the industrial world was just beginning to understand. The post-war reconstruction had become something more than reconstruction. It was a full economic transformation, and the automotive industry was one of its engines. Toyota, Nissan, and Honda were producing cars with tighter tolerances, better fuel economy, and longer service lives than much of what was coming out of Detroit or Wolfsburg. The gap was real. It was measurable. And yet the American establishment, dealers, executives, automotive journalists, largely treated Japanese imports as curiosities, cheap options for people who couldn't afford real cars. That assumption would take a few years to crack. The crack, when it came, arrived from a completely unexpected direction. October 1973. The Arab members of OPEC imposed an oil embargo on the United States in response to American support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Within weeks, the price of oil had quadrupled. Gas stations ran out of fuel. Lines formed around blocks, sometimes stretching for miles. Rationing was implemented, an odd-even system. You could buy gas on odd days if your license plate ended in an odd number, even days for even plates. Americans sat in their large, fuel-hungry cars and did arithmetic they had never had to do before. The average American car in 1973 got somewhere between 10 and 15 miles per gallon. A Honda Civic got approximately 40. Those numbers, placed side by side, explained a great deal. But Honda hadn't built the Civic because of the oil embargo. The engineering decisions had been made years earlier. The car was designed around frugality as a principle, not as a response to a crisis. When the crisis arrived, the Civic was simply there, already solving the problem, the way a good engineering decision tends to look prescient in retrospect. The first-generation Civic, sold between 1972 and 1979, was small in a way that genuinely startles people who encounter an original example today. The wheelbase was 86.6 inches. The engine was a 1.2-liter inline-4 producing around 50 horsepower. Curb weight was under 1,500 pounds. You could park two of them in the space a contemporary American full-size sedan required. The interior was honest and completely unadorned. No wood trim, no thick carpeting, no attempt to simulate luxury. The dashboard was functional. The seats were supportive. Everything was exactly what it needed to be, and nothing more. The styling, designed under the direction of Honda's engineers rather than a dedicated design studio, was clean without being particularly distinctive. It looked like a car built by people who were thinking primarily about function, which is what it was. The hatchback form was practical. The greenhouse was large. You could see out of it from every angle, which sounds like a modest achievement until you drive certain modern cars and realize how rarely it's prioritized. What sat under the hood was the genuinely interesting part. Honda had been working on a combustion system they called the CVCC, Compound Vortex Controlled Combustion, since the late 1960s. The system introduced a third, smaller intake valve, feeding a pre-chamber adjacent to the main combustion chamber. This pre-chamber received a rich fuel-air mixture and ignited first, providing a reliable ignition source for the much leaner mixture in the main chamber. The result was more complete combustion and dramatically reduced levels of hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, and oxides of nitrogen in the exhaust, all without a catalytic converter. The development of the CVCC happened against a specific political backdrop. The United States Clean Air Act of 1970 had set emission standards for 1975 and 1976 that most automakers considered technically impossible to meet on the proposed timeline. General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, and several others went to Congress and asked for a delay. The argument was straightforward. The technology doesn't exist to comply with these standards without destroying performance and dramatically increasing cost. Congress largely obliged them. Honda, working with the same chemistry and the same physics in a small research facility, arrived at a different conclusion. The CVCC system met the 1975 standards, not in 1975, but in 1972. 3 years before the deadline, without a catalytic converter. The engine was installed in a Civic and submitted to the United States Environmental Protection Agency for testing. The EPA tested it once, then again, then a third time, because the numbers were outside the range they had calibrated their expectations to. The emissions were that low. Yoshio Nakamura, who led the engine development team, recalled the period with characteristic understatement in later interviews. "The Americans expected us to fail," he said. "We expected to succeed." That difference in expectation drove the work. When the test results were confirmed, Honda offered to license the CVCC technology to other manufacturers. Ford accepted. Several others did not, preferring to continue lobbying for extended deadlines. The offer itself was its own kind of statement. "Here is the solution," Honda was saying. "We're happy to share it." The practical experience of owning an early Civic turned out to be something that spread by word of mouth faster than any advertising could have managed. The reliability was not accidental. Honda had built quality control processes derived partly from their motorcycle manufacturing experience, where a catastrophic mechanical failure on a moving vehicle was not just an inconvenience, but a safety crisis.
The same mentality transferred to four wheels. Components were tested beyond their expected service limits. Assembly processes were documented and audited. The gap between what the engineering drawing specified and what came off the line was narrower than industry averages. Consumer reports began including Japanese imports in their annual surveys in the early 1970s, and the reader satisfaction data was striking.
Honda owners reported fewer repairs in the first 3 years than almost any other brand. The gap was not marginal. It was large enough that it attracted editorial attention. Here was a car that cost less to buy, cost less to fuel, and cost less to maintain than the domestic competition. The arithmetic was not complicated. The dealership experience in those early years had its own character. Honda's American distribution network was small and somewhat improvised. Dealers operated out of facilities that were not always impressive. Inventory was limited. And yet the waiting lists grew through the mid-1970s as word spread through neighborhoods and workplaces and apartment complexes. There are documented cases of Civics selling above sticker price without any dealer markup justification, simply because demand exceeded supply, and buyers who had heard enough about the car from enough people were willing to pay more rather than wait. Honda's advertising budget in America was, by the standards of the major manufacturers, modest to the point of being almost philosophical. A few print ads, some radio. The message was plain and factual rather than aspirational. The car sold itself in a more direct way. It kept working. A mechanic at a Honda dealership in the San Fernando Valley, interviewed by a Los Angeles Times reporter in 1976, said something that got quoted widely. "I've been working on these cars for 4 years and I haven't seen one come in with an engine problem that wasn't the owner's fault." That wasn't marketing. That was a mechanic describing his experience. The second generation arrived in 1979, slightly larger, a little more refined, still fundamentally the same concept. The CVCC engine had been developed further. Fuel economy remained exceptional. The car had found its audience: young professionals, recent graduates, urban dwellers, people for whom practicality was not a concession but a value. Then the third generation, introduced in 1984, brought something new: the SI trim, the sportier hatchback variants, a range of body styles that gave buyers actual choices. And with these choices came a different kind of customer: younger, less focused on pure practicality, more interested in what the car felt like to drive. The feeling was, it turned out, rather good. The engineering philosophy that had made the Civic reliable had also, as a byproduct, made it light and mechanically honest. The steering was direct. The chassis was stiff relative to its weight. The suspension, while tuned primarily for comfort and durability, was well conceived enough that you could push it and feel something coherent push back. There was a communication between driver and car that larger, heavier, more softly sprung vehicles simply didn't offer. Not because Honda had designed it in, but because they hadn't designed it out. Teenagers noticed. Young men who read car magazines and dreamed about things they couldn't afford noticed that the Civic did something interesting when you took it somewhere challenging. The car rewarded attention. It rewarded smoothness. It had the quality that driving enthusiasts value most in a small car, the quality that is hardest to engineer in by committee and easiest to accidentally include when you're primarily trying to be honest about what a machine should be. The aftermarket was paying attention by the mid-1980s. Suspension components, intake systems, headers, the sort of modification culture that had existed around American muscle cars for decades was beginning, quietly, to form around Japanese compact cars. The Honda was ideal for this purpose, not because Honda had designed for modification, but because the underlying engineering was good enough to sustain being pushed. The tolerances were tight, the block was strong, the geometry responded to changes in predictable ways. By the late 1980s, there were Honda-specific shops in California, in Japan, in Australia, in the United Kingdom. The ecosystem was real. The fourth and fifth generations, the 1988 and 1992 models, are where the story accelerates in ways Honda almost certainly didn't entirely anticipate. The EG Civic, as the 1992 fifth generation came to be known in enthusiast communities, was something close to perfect for its intended purpose. The hatchback body style was light. The 1.5-liter SOHC engine was competent and very tunable. The chassis was well sorted. The car handled in a way that rewarded commitment. You had to drive it with intention, and when you did, it responded with something approaching enthusiasm. The B-Series engine family, introduced across Honda's lineup in this period, changed the conversation entirely. The B16A, the B18, the various derivative configurations. These engines had a combination of qualities that made them exceptional tuning platforms. Strong forged internals from the factory. Good cylinder head flow. A VTEC, variable valve timing system that Honda had been developing since the late 1980s, which produced a distinctive and memorable power delivery, relatively smooth at low revs, then a sudden, urgent surge when the VTEC crossover point was reached, somewhere between 5,500 and 6,000 revolutions per minute, depending on the specific tune. The sound the engine made crossing that threshold became its own kind of cultural reference point. VTEC, variable valve timing and lift electronic control, worked by using 2 camshaft profiles per cylinder. Below the crossover RPM, the engine operated on a profile optimized for low-end torque and fuel efficiency. Above it, a second profile engaged, opening the valves further and for longer, allowing the engine to breathe more freely at high revs. The result was an engine that functioned practically as 2 different engines, depending on how hard you drove it. Honda had been pursuing variable valve timing since the early 1980s, and the road-going VTEC system, introduced on the high-performance Integra in 1989 and extended across the Civic range through the 1990s, was the production realization of that work. The street racing culture that formed around these cars in Southern California and simultaneously in Japan, in the drift and time attack communities that were developing there, was documented eventually in ways that exaggerated its drama and simplified its sociology. The reality was less cinematic and more interesting. It was young men and women with limited budgets finding that a used Honda Civic could be made, with careful investment and genuine mechanical knowledge, into a competitive platform. Sika autocross, drag racing, track days, time attack events at Willow Springs and Button Willow, and the various parking lot circuits that organizers would occasionally arrange and then hastily disassemble before anyone official arrived. The knowledge circulated through photocopied magazines, through early internet forums, through shop talk. What camshafts worked? What suspension geometry actually needed changing? Which intake manifold gained real power, and which was a waste of money? A community of very serious, very methodical people who happened to be working on cheap Japanese hatchbacks. Honda acknowledged what was happening by making it official. The Type R designation had origins in Honda's Formula 2 racing program in the late 1960s, where R simply denoted racing specification. Applied to a road car, it meant something more specific. A production vehicle built to the standards Honda's engineers believed were achievable without compromise, rather than the standards that production economics normally imposed. The EK9 Civic Type R, sold in Japan from 1997, was the clearest statement of this philosophy as applied to a small car. The B16B engine, a 1.6-liter unit producing 182 horsepower, was assembled by individual engineers rather than production line workers,
each engine bearing a badge with the assembler's name. The compression ratio was 10.8 to 1, which required premium fuel and accepted absolutely no shortcuts in component quality. The camshafts were ground to a more aggressive profile than the standard B16A. The intake manifold was tuned for high RPM performance. The red line was 8,500 RPM, which in a 1.6-liter engine requires engineering precision that cannot be improvised. The chassis changes were equally considered. The front suspension geometry was revised specifically for the Type R, with a stiffer anti-roll bar and retuned dampers. The rear suspension used the double wishbone layout from the Civic SIR rather than the torsion beam of base models. The steering rack was quicker. The limited slip differential managed power delivery to the front wheels. The seats were Recaro buckets.
The brake rotors were ventilated front and rear, which was not standard on compact cars of this class. The car weighed approximately 2,204 pounds. With 182 horsepower, the power-to-weight ratio placed it in conversations with machinery that cost considerably more. Journalists who drove it wrote about it with the kind of specificity you use when something surprises you. Detailed descriptions of the steering feel, the gear change quality, the way the chassis responded to inputs, because those details were interesting in ways the specs alone didn't capture. The close ratio 6-speed gearbox deserves its own sentence. The throws were short. The gates were precise. The synchros engaged cleanly at any speed you chose to shift. It was a piece of equipment that communicated something about how seriously the people who built this car were taking the problem of driving it. You used the gearbox constantly because using it felt like the right thing to do. This is not a quality that can be engineered by accident. The cultural saturation of the Civic in the 1990s is genuinely difficult to overstate for anyone who didn't live through it. By the mid-1990s, the Civic was the best-selling car in Canada. In the United States, it consistently ranked in the top 5 best-selling vehicles overall, not in the compact segment, overall, meaning it was competing favorably with full-size trucks and minivans for raw volume. In a country where truck culture was and remains a significant part of national automotive identity, this is a remarkable fact. The theft statistics were both consequence and indicator. The Honda Civic led, or nearly led, insurance industry lists of most stolen vehicles in the United States for most of the late 1990s and into the 2000s. The reasons were several. Volume meant many targets of opportunity. The parts market was deep because so many Civics needed repair, and the cars were, as various sources noted with a certain reluctant respect, mechanically forgiving of the stress of being stolen. You could start them without the key through various methods that the internet eventually cataloged in unfortunate detail, and the mechanical components survived the experience without damage. That last detail is its own kind of quality assessment. The 6th generation, produced from 1996 to 2000, represents for many observers the clearest expression of everything the Civic had become. The EK hatchback's lines were resolved in a way the previous generations had not quite been. The proportions were right. The greenhouse was sized correctly relative to the body. The wheels sat in the arches with the right amount of clearance. The details, like the flush headlights and the subtle body side character lines, read as considered rather than styled. The sedan was similarly well proportioned, managing to look complete rather than truncated, which compact sedans often fail to do. Mechanically, the 6th generation was the refinement of everything that had come before. The VTEC engines in their various states of tune provided a range of options from genuinely economical to genuinely quick. The chassis was sorted in a way that reflected 20 years of accumulated understanding about what made a small front-wheel drive car feel right. The build quality was, by consensus, the best Honda had achieved in a Civic to that point. Then things got complicated. Not immediately, and not obviously, but in the way that happens to successful things that have more to lose than to gain from taking risks. The seventh generation, introduced in 2001, was larger. The growth was not irrational. The American market consistently rewarded size, and Honda was no longer fighting for credibility. They were one of the largest automakers on the planet, with the resources and responsibilities that accompany that position. The decision to make the car more comfortable, quieter, and less demanding made commercial sense. The Civic's audience had aged alongside it. The young people who had bought EGs in 1993 were now in their 30s, possibly with children and lumbar pain. What was lost in the transition was the edge. The steering wheel told you less. The chassis, softened for comfort, communicated less. The car remained, by most objective measures, excellent. It started reliably, maintained its fuel efficiency advantage, and continued to outlast most of its competitors by considerable margins. But the quality of the driving experience had been rounded off, and the people who cared about that quality noticed immediately and wrote about it at length on forums that were by then very large and very active. The eighth generation, in 2006, divided opinion on the interior design. The dual-level instrument cluster was either innovative or annoying depending on who you asked, and the answer correlated strongly with age. The SI returned with a 2.0-liter engine producing 197 horsepower, which should have been exciting, but the reviews were careful rather than enthusiastic. The ninth generation, introduced in 2011, is the one Honda would probably prefer not to discuss at length. Consumer Reports, which had been broadly positive about the Civic for more than 2 decades, gave it an unusually poor review. The magazine called the interior quality disappointing and the driving experience unimpressive. This was not a niche complaint from enthusiasts. This was Consumer Reports, whose readers were exactly the practical, reliability-focused buyers the Civic had always served. Honda responded by acknowledging the criticism publicly, updating the car mid-cycle in 2013, and beginning a more thorough rethinking for the subsequent generation. The acknowledgement was notable because large automakers rarely do it. It suggested that someone inside Honda understood that something important had been lost. The 10th generation Civic, arriving in 2016, was a genuine recovery and was received as one. The exterior design was more confident than anything Honda had done with the Civic in 15 years. The interior quality improved substantially. The turbocharged 1.5-liter engine in the standard models offered a combination of efficiency and performance that was competitive with anything in the segment. And the Type R, now sold globally for the first time rather than being restricted to Japan and a few other markets, made an unambiguous statement. The FK8 Type R, 316 horsepower from a turbocharged 2.0-liter engine, 0 to 60 in about 5.7 seconds, and the Nürburgring Nordschleife lap time of 7 minutes and 43.8 seconds, set in 2017, was the fastest front-wheel drive production car to have circled that circuit at the time. The record didn't last indefinitely, as these records don't, but the act of setting it communicated something that a press release couldn't. Honda had not gone soft. The capacity was still there. The institutional knowledge of how to build a truly serious small car had not evaporated. The 11th generation, introduced in 2022, continued the recovery. The Type R iteration, produced in 2023, ran the Nürburgring in 7 minutes and 44.88 seconds on standard Michelin Pilot Sport Cup 2 tires, and in a separate exercise on Bridgestone Potenza race compound tires, completed the circuit in 7 minutes and 24.9 seconds, which places it in rarefied company. Cars that run the Nordschleife in that kind of time are not cheap, compact family sedans, except this one is. What's strange about the Civic, looked at across 50 years, is how much of its significance is quiet. There are cars whose importance is announced,
You know them when you see them. The Ferrari 250 GTO, the Ford GT40, the Porsche 911. These are cars that arrive in a room and change the atmosphere. The Civic was never that. It was always the car in the background, the one you didn't look at directly, but which was always there when you needed it. Your neighbor had one, or your older sister,
Or the family 2 streets over. The practical, sensible family who bought it because a coworker told them to, and then kept it for 200,000 miles and quietly bought another one. The Civic was present in the way that essential things are present. Ubiquitous, unremarkable, noticed primarily in absence. There are Civics with documented odometer readings above 400,000 miles. Not restored, not rebuilt from component parts, but driven. Maintained carefully, certainly, but fundamentally the same cars that left the factory, accumulating distance the way a good tool accumulates use. The number 400,000 means different things on different cars. On a Civic, it means a certain kind of engineering commitment was made and kept. The people who built the original CVCC engine, who solved the emissions problem that the American industry had declared unsolvable, were working in a culture that Soichiro Honda had constructed around the belief that honest engineering mattered. Honda died in 1991, having watched his motorcycle company become one of the largest automakers in the world without, by most accounts, changing his fundamental orientation toward the work. He was an engineer. The cars should work. They should work correctly. That was the whole brief. He never saw the Nürburgring records. He never saw the tuning culture, the forum builds, the EG on jack stands in garages across 4 continents. He never saw the Civic sell 1 million units in the United States in a single year, or lead the Canadian sales charts, or become the reference point that other compact cars measured themselves against whether they admitted it or not. He never saw any of it. But the engineering philosophy he installed in a small company in Hamamatsu in the late 1940s produced all of it, eventually. The question that hangs over the Civic now is the same question hanging over every car with a combustion engine and a manual gearbox and 50 years of mechanical tradition behind it. The electric transition is real, and Honda has made commitments to electrification timelines that will reshape the lineup. An electric Civic, in some form, is likely. What it will feel like is genuinely unknown. Whether the directness, the mechanical honesty, the quality of communication between driver and car that made the best Civics genuinely good to drive can survive the transition to a fundamentally different powertrain architecture. These are not rhetorical questions. Nobody knows the answers yet. What the combustion Civic leaves behind is a body of evidence about a particular approach to making cars. The approach is not glamorous. It doesn't involve dramatic design statements or record-breaking power figures in the base specification. It involves taking a modest premise, small car, good engine, built correctly, and executing it with enough seriousness and enough consistency over enough years that the car becomes something other than just a car. It becomes a standard. The standard is carried in very specific places. In the feel of a B-series engine spinning freely past 7,000 revolutions per minute in a car that weighs less than a current mid-size SUV. In the gear change of a Type R transmission that 30 years of refinement has made near perfect. In the reliability data that keeps accumulating in consumer report surveys and insurance industry actuarial tables, and the informal testimony of owners who keep driving cars they bought used and find they can't justify replacing. Somewhere in a garage right now, there is a 1993 EG hatchback on jack stands with the engine out. The owner is fitting a set of camshafts from a different application. The project has been ongoing for 1.5 years. There are detailed photographs of every disassembled component posted to a forum where somewhere between 20 and 50 people follow the build. Some of them occasionally offering advice about the correct torque spec for a particular fastener. Some of them simply watching because they find the work interesting. Some of these people are in their 50s and have been working on Civics since the early 1990s. Some are in their early 20s and encountered the car through videos and found something in the engineering that seemed worth understanding. They are arguing, with genuine conviction and genuine good humor, about the correct oil viscosity for a high-compression, naturally aspirated engine in a cold climate. The argument is not going to be resolved. It never is. Nobody actually wants it resolved. The car sits there, patient, in pieces, waiting. The engine is going back in next weekend, or the weekend after, depending on the weather and whether the correct intake gasket has arrived from a supplier in California. When it's finished, the owner will drive it somewhere. Maybe a track day, maybe just a good road. And the car will do what it has always done, which is communicate honestly with whoever is driving it, without drama, without pretense, the way it always has. There is a specific kind of loyalty that forms around a car that has never let you down. It isn't the loyalty of enthusiasm, the kind that makes someone put a poster on a wall or stand in a show queue for hours. It's quieter than that, and in some ways more durable. It's the loyalty of a person who drove a car through the worst winter their city had seen in a decade, and the car started every morning, and they have never quite forgotten it. Honda cultivated that loyalty without intending to cultivate it, which is the only honest way to cultivate it. They made a car that worked, year after year, decade after decade, and people remembered. The first-generation buyers who traded their unreliable domestic sedans for a Civic in 1974 and discovered that it simply kept working told their children, who bought Civics in the late 1980s, who told their colleagues, who bought them in the 1990s, who recommended them to younger siblings buying first cars in the 2000s. The chain of testimony is unbroken across generations in a way that advertising cannot manufacture. You can't buy that kind of word of mouth. You can only earn it, and you earn it one cold morning at a time, 100,000-mile interval at a time, one repair bill that came in under the estimate at a time. The engineering has changed in ways that would be unrecognizable to the team that developed the CVCC in 1972. The current Civic uses a turbocharged, direct injection engine managed by processors that did not exist when the first Civic was designed. The chassis incorporates materials and manufacturing processes that were theoretical in 1972. The safety systems, automatic emergency braking, lane keeping assist, adaptive cruise control, represent more computing power than existed in the entire Honda Corporation when Soichiro Honda was running it. The car is incomparably more sophisticated in almost every measurable dimension than what left the factory 50 years ago. What has not changed is harder to describe, but easier to experience. Drive a current Civic Si back-to-back with a well-maintained sixth-generation car, and you will feel something consistent underneath the half-century of development. A sense that the people who built these cars were trying to be honest about what a car is for. Not what it should project, not what it should signal. What it should do when you get in it and drive it, in the rain, in the cold, on a road that bends more than you expected. That quality, functional honesty, dressed in ordinary clothes, asking nothing from you except that you use it, is rarer in the car industry than it should be. Most cars are trying to be something. Most of the time you can feel what they're trying to be. The Civic, at its best, just is. In a Honda facility in Sayama, Japan in the mid-1990s,
There were engineers who had been working on Civic engines for over 15 years. They had lived through the CVCC development, the VTEC introduction, the iterative refinements of the B series. Some of them kept photographs of early test cars on their desks. Not glamorous photos, not racing photos, just cars on test roads in ordinary weather. The kind of documentation that accumulates when you spend a long time trying to make something right. What those engineers knew, in a way that is hard to transfer through management presentations or strategy documents, was the specific feel of what they were trying to achieve.
The weight of the gear lever. The precise moment the clutch fully engaged. The sound the engine made at 7,000 revolutions per minute when everything was exactly right. These details lived in hands and ears, not in specification sheets. And the transmission of that knowledge across decades and personnel changes and corporate reorganizations is one of the genuine challenges of manufacturing tradition. Honda managed it better than most. Not perfectly. The 7th, 8th, and 9th generation Civics are evidence that the thread can thin, that priorities can shift, that institutional memory can erode under commercial pressure. But the 10th and 11th generations are evidence that it can be recovered, that the knowledge was not entirely lost, that somewhere in the organization there were people who remembered what the car was supposed to feel like and were given the authority, eventually, to make it feel that way again. That recovery, the deliberate act of returning to a standard rather than simply moving forward, is its own kind of story. It requires admitting that you drifted. Large automakers do not like to admit that. Honda admitted it, and then went and set a lap record. The Civic sits somewhere outside the usual categories we use to understand significant cars. It is not a supercar. It is not a landmark of design. It has never been the most powerful, the most expensive, or the most visually arresting vehicle of its era. It has simply been, for 50 years, the most consistently itself. A small car, well made, that kept working long after it was supposed to stop, that met emission standards no one else could meet, that gave young people with no money a platform for genuine motorsport involvement, that provided reliable transportation for more people across more economic circumstances than almost any other vehicle in history. The garage is getting dark. The engine is on the stand. Someone has written the torque specs on a piece of masking tape stuck to the workbench, next to a coffee cup that went cold an hour ago. The work continues, the way work on something you believe in continues, past the point where it made sense to stop, into the territory where it simply matters. That's where the Civic has always lived.